The year opened under a sky that offered no relief. Across vast stretches of northern China, the earth had already begun to fail. Crops withered before maturity, river levels fell, and the land hardened into dust. For millions living under the Ming Dynasty, survival narrowed to a daily calculation of hunger and endurance. What began as a cycle of poor harvests soon deepened into a crisis that would not remain confined to the fields. By 1628, famine was no longer a regional hardship. It was a destabilizing force, eroding the foundations of one of the world's most enduring imperial systems and setting in motion a chain of events that would reshape China's future. The Ming Dynasty, established in 1368, had ruled for over 2.5 centuries. Its early strength rested on centralized authority, agricultural productivity, and a complex administrative system. Yet by the early 17th century, that stability had begun to weaken. Fiscal strain burdened the government, exacerbated by military expenses along the northern frontier and internal corruption that drained resources from state coffers. At the same time, environmental pressures intensified. A period often associated with the broader climatic pattern known as the Little Ice Age brought colder temperatures and unpredictable weather, shortening growing seasons and increasing the frequency of droughts and floods. By the 1620s, these conditions converged with alarming consequences. Northern provinces such as Shaanxi and Shanxi experienced repeated crop failures. Grain reserves dwindled, and local granaries, once a buffer against hardship, were often empty or mismanaged. Tax obligations, however, remained unchanged. Even as harvests failed, peasants were still required to meet state demands, pushing many into debt or forcing them to abandon their land altogether. The year 1628 marked a turning point because the cumulative pressures reached a threshold that could no longer be contained. Famine spread across large regions, displacing populations and disrupting local economies. Starvation was accompanied by the breakdown of social order in rural areas. Banditry increased, not as isolated criminal activity but as a widespread response to desperation. Groups of displaced peasants formed armed bands, initially seeking food and survival, but gradually evolving into organized rebel forces. The Ming government, already strained, struggled to respond effectively. Communication between the central court in Beijing and distant provinces was slow, and local officials often lacked the resources or authority to manage large-scale crises. In some cases, relief efforts were attempted: grain distributions, tax reductions, or temporary aid, but these measures were inconsistent and frequently insufficient. Corruption further undermined their effectiveness, as officials diverted supplies or failed to implement policies as intended. Among the most significant developments of this period was the emergence of organized rebellion in famine-stricken regions. In Shaanxi, one of the hardest-hit provinces, displaced farmers and soldiers began to coalesce under leaders who could provide direction and structure. These were not initially ideological movements but pragmatic responses to survival. Over time, however, they adopted broader objectives, including resistance to local authorities and, eventually, opposition to the Ming state itself. One such figure was Li Zicheng, a former postal worker who had experienced firsthand the hardships of the period. His early involvement in rebellion reflected the conditions shared by many: loss of livelihood, inability to meet tax obligations, and lack of state support. As the famine persisted, Li and others like him gained followers, not through coercion but through the shared experience of deprivation. Their ranks grew as more individuals, unable to sustain themselves within the existing system, turned to collective action. The spread of rebellion was facilitated by geography and circumstance. Northern China's vast and often sparsely governed regions allowed armed groups to move with relative freedom. As they moved, they drew in new recruits and extended their influence. The Ming military, tasked with suppressing these uprisings, faced its own challenges. Soldiers were often underpaid, poorly supplied, and sometimes sympathetic to the grievances of the rebels. In some instances, entire units defected or joined rebel forces, further weakening the state's capacity to respond. Economic disruption compounded the crisis. Trade routes became unsafe, markets declined, and urban centers felt the effects of rural instability. Food shortages led to rising prices, making basic necessities inaccessible to many. The interconnected nature of the Ming economy meant that localized famine could have far-reaching consequences, affecting regions that had not yet experienced crop failure directly. At the same time, the Ming court faced pressures beyond internal unrest. Along the northeastern frontier, the Manchu state was consolidating power under leaders who would later establish the Qing dynasty. While the events of 1628 were primarily internal, the need to maintain defenses against external threats placed additional strain on Ming resources. Funds and attention that might have been directed toward famine relief and internal stability were divided, limiting the government's ability to address either challenge effectively. The social fabric of affected regions began to fray. Traditional community structures, which had historically provided mutual support during difficult times, were overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis. Families were forced to migrate in search of food, leaving behind homes and farmland. In some areas, entire villages were abandoned. This mass displacement not only reflected the severity of the famine but also contributed to the spread of unrest, as displaced populations moved into new regions and strained local resources. Despite these challenges, it is important to recognize that the collapse of the Ming Dynasty was not immediate. The events of 1628 represented the beginning of a prolonged period of instability rather than a sudden end. The dynasty would continue for another decade and a half, but the patterns established during this time, environmental stress, economic disruption, and widespread rebellion, would persist and intensify. Efforts at reform and recovery were attempted, though often with limited success. Some officials advocated for tax relief, improved grain distribution systems, and measures to combat corruption. In certain areas, these initiatives provided temporary relief. However, the scale of the crisis required coordinated and sustained action that the Ming administration struggled to deliver. Structural weaknesses within the government, including factional disputes at court and inefficiencies in the bureaucracy, hindered comprehensive solutions. The human toll of the famine and subsequent unrest was substantial, though precise figures are difficult to determine. Contemporary records and later historical analyses suggest that millions were affected through starvation, displacement, and conflict. The impact was not limited to those directly experiencing famine. The broader population felt the consequences through economic hardship, insecurity, and the gradual erosion of state authority. By examining the events of 1628, it becomes clear that the crisis was not the result of a single cause but rather the convergence of multiple factors. Environmental change reduced agricultural output, fiscal pressures limited the government's capacity to respond, and social inequalities exacerbated the effects on vulnerable populations. Together, these elements created conditions in which famine could trigger widespread unrest and challenge the stability of the state. As the years progressed, the rebellions that began in famine-stricken regions would grow in scale and ambition. Leaders like Li Zicheng would expand their influence, eventually capturing key cities and posing a direct threat to the Ming capital. The government's inability to effectively suppress these movements or address their underlying causes would further weaken its position. The significance of 1628 lies in its role as a catalyst. It marks the point at which existing vulnerabilities within the Ming dynasty were exposed and amplified by external pressures. The famine did not create these weaknesses, but it accelerated their consequences, transforming localized hardship into systemic crisis. In the broader context of Chinese history, the fall of the Ming dynasty and the rise of the Qing dynasty represent a major transition. The events set in motion during this period would culminate in 1644, when Beijing fell to rebel forces and the Qing established their rule. The legacy of this transition would shape the political, cultural, and social landscape of China for centuries to come. Yet the story of 1628 is not solely about the end of a dynasty. It is also a reflection of how environmental and economic pressures can interact with political systems, revealing strengths and weaknesses that might otherwise remain hidden. The experiences of those who lived through the famine, farmers, officials, soldiers, and rebels illustrate the human dimension of historical change, where large-scale transformations are driven by the cumulative effects of individual lives under strain. In the end, the crisis of 1628 serves as a reminder that stability is often contingent on factors beyond immediate control. When environmental challenges intersect with governance failures and social inequality, the resulting pressures can reshape even the most established institutions. The Ming dynasty, once a symbol of order and continuity, found itself unable to withstand these combined forces. What began as a failure of the harvest became a turning point in history. The famine that spread across northern China did more than take lives, it altered the trajectory of a civilization. Through its consequences, it revealed the fragile balance between state authority and the conditions that sustain it, a balance that, once disrupted, proved difficult to restore.